The city of York is reputedly one of the most haunted cities in England. Ghosts are said to roam within the atmospheric streets and historic buildings of this walled city. York has a troubled past. The Romans built a fortress and city here. Vikings raided and captured York. The Black Death took the lives of thousands, and it was besieged by parliamentarians during the English Civil War. Here are just some of the numerous ghost stories from the magnificent city of York. The Grade 2 listed building, the Old White Swan, is one of the city's oldest and most beloved pubs. This historic collection of buildings creates a unique inn, and parts date back to the 16th century. At the rear of the courtyard are timber-framed structures, as well as a stone rock with 4 steps that was used as a mounting stone to help people board the stagecoaches in its coaching past. The timber-framed main building was used as an inn by 1703, and for many years the inn was promoted as a stop for those travelling long distances by coach and as a convenient location from which to visit York Racecourse. A farmers' market was occasionally held here, along with billiard competitions and other sporting events. In August 1781, the Lord Mayor granted the pub permission to display Patrick Cotter O'Brien, claimed as the world's tallest man, at a lofty 8 feet, with the landlord charging £1 to see the spectacle. The Old White Swan, like so many of the pubs in York, is said to be haunted by several apparitions. Back in the 18th century, York, with many other cities, was desperately searched for papists, those who still held allegiance with the Catholic Church, failing to convert to the Church of England. The possibility of a Jacobite rising meant religious and political tensions simmered across the land. Constables would be employed to keep watch across inns and meeting places, and it is thought that the Old White Swan pub was a secret meeting place for papists who were plotting to flee to France. Some have observed the ghostly figures of 4 men gathered around a blazing fire in the early morning. Oddly, the fire itself seems to have been relit after the staff had extinguished it earlier. The men are seen as solid apparitions, dressed in waistcoats and riding gear, and laughing and chatting over a few drinks. Staff and guests have witnessed furniture move by itself, and the sounds of muffled voices and footsteps near the bar when it is particularly quiet. Another spirit is said to haunt the Old White Swan, just near to where the jovial men have been seen, by the fireplace. He is a solitary man, seen smoking a pipe, and is semi-transparent in appearance. He has grey hair and wears a dark suit. He is believed to be the spirit of a man named Cooper, who lived and worked on Goodramgate at a greengrocer's in the late 1800s. He was a regular at the Old White Swan, and he died unexpectedly when delivering groceries via horse and trap to customers just outside of the city. His horse had become startled by a sudden noise, set into a gallop, and threw Cooper to his death. He sadly left a wife and 9 children. Perhaps he returns to a place near his family home that held such fond memories in his lifetime. The Yorkshire Museum opened in 1830 and is one of the longest established museums in England. It houses a range of collections, including biology, geology, archaeology and astronomy. It also houses a resident ghost. On weekends, the museum was sometimes the venue for evangelical meetings. On Sunday, the 20th of September 1953, Mr. George Jonas, the museum's caretaker, was in the basement kitchen, preparing to close up the museum, when he heard footsteps from the museum floor above. As he climbed the stairs, he saw a figure of a man crossing from the main office towards the library. He described the man as a balding elderly chap wearing a frock coat, drainpipe trousers, and with fluffy side whiskers, and walking with a stoop. He witnessed the figure heading towards the library, where he muttered, "I must find it, I must find it." Jonas called out to the man, but he didn't respond. He followed him into the library, where he saw the man pull out several books from the shelf. Thinking he might be hard of hearing, he reached his right hand out to touch the gentleman's shoulder, but he vanished, and the book he'd been holding fell to the floor. Jonas recorded the time as 8:40 p.m. British Summer Time. The keeper of the museum, Mr. George Wilmot, was told about the curious incident and accompanied Mr. Jonas for the next few Sunday evenings. On Sunday the 18th of October, the ghostly man reappeared, crossing the hall and passing through the locked library door. The time was 7:40 p.m. GMT, as the clocks had recently been put back an hour. 4 weeks later, and Jonas and a friend settled themselves in the library at 7:40. The phantom didn't appear, but the sounds of a book falling to the ground startled them both. The book's title was Curiosities of the Church, written by William Andrews in 1891. The book had been bequeathed to the library in 1927 by Alderman Edward Wooler of Darlington. The Wooler family were contacted, and a photograph of Alderman Wooler was sent to the library. Jonas immediately identified the apparition as being Wooler. Wooler was a well-read man and often used the pages of his books as a filing system for letters and photographs. No personal items were found in the pages of the book, but there were marks on the inside cover as though a document or photograph had been housed there in the past. The local press reported the story, expecting the ghost to appear every 4 weeks. Sadly, the apparition didn't keep its monthly appearance in the library, much to the disappointment of those hoping to view the figure. Why Alderman Wooler was haunting the Yorkshire Museum, nobody knows. Today, Coney Street is a major shopping street in the centre of York. It was first established by the Romans, and over the centuries, it became an important street for banking, coaching, book publishing, and became the home of the Yorkshire Evening Post and Yorkshire Herald. With the advent of the national network of stagecoach routes in the 18th century, Coney Street became home to two of the city's coaching inns, the George Inn, demolished in 1869, and on the opposite side of the street, the Black Swan Hotel, demolished in 1955. Horses were everywhere in Georgian and Victorian York, and it seems the ghostly sounds of horses are still heard to this day. The rich travelled in elegant horse-drawn carriages. Carts hauled goods to market, were used to transport fresh meat to the butchers of the shambles, and used to transport the deceased to their final resting places. Streets were crowded. Horses could be wayward and escape, leaving a trail of destruction behind them. Accidents involving horses and carts across the city were frequent and often deadly. In 1877, a 3-year-old boy named Francis Harrison was killed at Castlegate when he was hit by a wagon laden with wood. In 1912, a man named Thomas was painting the Golden Slipper Inn at Goodramgate. He was up a ladder at a height of 50 feet when a runaway horse pulling a cart knocked the ladder away. He died later in hospital. Ghostly sounds of horses on Coney Street have been heard in the vicinity of the beautiful St Martin-le-Grand church, just near the Little Admiral clock. In 1956, late at night, two women were walking towards St Helens Square. Behind them, they heard the sound of horses' hooves, the sound of wooden wheels coming to an abrupt halt, and an almighty crashing sound. Completely terrified, they turned around expecting to see a terrible sight, but there was nothing there, and the sound stopped abruptly. The church was left as a smouldering ruin during a bombing raid on the city in 1942 and stood desolate until restoration work began in 1961. In 1965, 4 men working late at night inside the church, near the location of the current altar, heard the sounds of horses' hooves and a terrible crash outside of the church. Convinced a serious accident had taken place, they rushed out of the main entrance and around onto Coney Street, but there was nothing to see. All 4 of the men heard the sounds and thought something had crashed into the wall of the church itself. They reported the event to a nearby policeman, who seemed completely unfazed by what the men described. It seemed he was aware of these ghostly sounds, and that they had been reported before. He suggested a coach may have crashed at the site years ago. Nobody is sure why these ghostly, disturbing sounds are heard, but a terrible incident took place here in 1884. On the 22nd of October, Thomas Rooney, a 13-year-old schoolboy and son of a bricklayer, was selling newspapers in the vicinity of St Helens Square. He'd sold out of his stock and ran through Coney Street to his friend, Thomas MacLeod, aged 11. The pair decided that if they could both sell as many papers as possible in 2 locations, they could split the takings between them. Thomas MacLeod only had a few papers left, so they raced to the York Herald office and grabbed extra evening newspapers to sell. They were on Coney Street, dividing the papers between them, when Thomas Rooney was hit by a cart being driven by the ostler from the Black Swan Hotel. He died from his injuries about an hour later. At the inquest, the incident was described by a witness. He believed one of the front wheels caught the deceased and struck him on the chest. He was knocked down. The 2 lads were in the middle of the street, and they appeared to be dividing newspapers between them. When about 10 yards distant, the witness called them to get out of the way, and he believed that the driver did so too. The latter pulled up his horse as quickly as he could. He thought they heard the shout, and tried to move off the roadway, the deceased taking to the side on which the public clock is, the driver being on the near side, seated on his box. The inquest seems to be full of contradictions. Witnesses were unable to agree whether the cart was being driven too quickly. A police officer said that the driver was going at a rapid pace, to the danger of foot passengers. However, the owner of the Black Swan Hotel, travelling on the cart itself, said the horse was proceeding at an ordinary trot. One witness said the driver, Alfred Robinson, the ostler at the Black Swan Hotel, tried to stop the horses, whereas another witness said that the cart drove on unaware. The surgeon who treated Rooney declared that on the boy's admission to hospital, he was suffering from a fractured skull, fractured ribs and intense shock. Death ensued an hour later. Eventually, the case against Robinson was escalated to manslaughter. More witnesses were brought forward, who claimed the cart was travelling between 11 and 14 miles an hour. Alfred Robinson was tried at the York Assizes, where the jury felt there was insufficient evidence to continue, and the case concluded. Whether the ghostly sounds on Coney Street are attributed to this tragic event in 1884, we will never know. Perhaps another incident took place at the clock of St Martin-le-Grand. But what we do know, sadly, is that in 1884, a 13-year-old paperboy, was struck here and died later from terrible injuries. The city of York has been defended by walls since the Roman times. The current walls largely date from the 13th and 14th centuries, and the Victorians made alterations to extend and widen some of the sections. The walls incorporate 4 gatehouses, or bars, entry points into the city. These restricted traffic throughout the year, allowed tolls to be paid, and were important defences during times of war. Micklegate Bar is the most important of the medieval gateways, and was the entrance point for anyone arriving from the south. Micklegate Bar is the ceremonial entrance for royalty visiting York, who, in a tradition attributed to Richard II in 1389, touch the state sword as they enter the city. The gateway would be guarded by a custodian who would live in the tower itself. Micklegate Bar served as a family home from 1196 to 1918, with many births and deaths. The most active ghost here is that of Sarah Brocklebank, a gatekeeper's daughter who lived here in the late 18th century. Her father, Thomas Brocklebank, was responsible for locking the gates each night as the curfew bell rang, and opening them at dawn the following day. On her birthday in 1797, the young girl invited her friends to a party at the tower. They played games including hide and seek, and the afternoon passed with much laughter. As the curfew sounded, Thomas went to lock the gate, but the keys had disappeared. Suspecting his daughter and her friends were playing a practical joke, he angrily asked her to find the keys. The gates were held closed temporarily with a wooden plank, but this was insufficient. Despite searching and searching for days, the keys remained missing. Time passed, and Thomas had to confess to his employer that the keys were lost. He was sacked immediately, and the family were thrown out of Micklegate Bar, with a life of destitution ahead of them. For 40 years, the sad, lonely figure of Sarah Brocklebank was seen searching the city, along the walls, in the snickleways, rummaging through the city's refuse. One night, the Mayor of York was holding a dinner party for wealthy merchants, when an almighty din was heard. The restless figure of Sarah Brocklebank appeared and declared over and over that she'd found the keys. He asked where they were. As she went to answer, she clutched her chest and dropped down dead. The keys still remain wherever Sarah had found them. Inside Micklegate Bar is a museum called City Walls Experience. Visitors have seen the solid apparition of a young girl wearing a long dress, brushing past them at speed, perhaps reliving some of the birthday party games. Some visitors have even held a conversation with this young girl. The sounds of metal keys jangling has been heard, and people have reported the smell of metal and rust on their hands, as if they have been handling the keys themselves. The custodians, before they close the tower for the evening, ensure all of the lights are turned off. The following day, the lights are sometimes on, and the pull cord has been gathered into a knot and placed on a shelf. York is dominated by the formidable York Minster, one of the largest cathedrals in Northern Europe. The beautiful building stands proudly in the city centre and houses one of Europe's most impressive collections of medieval stained glass. In 1215, Walter de Grey, the Archbishop of York, ordered the construction of a Gothic-style cathedral to rival that of Canterbury. Building began in 1220, and it took nearly 250 years to complete. Hundreds of stonemasons, carpenters and construction workers would have created the cathedral we see today. A team of 16 stonemasons currently work to preserve and maintain its unique Gothic architecture. During the mid-1960s, renovations took place on the west front of the building. Stonemasons worked carefully to replace and restore the exterior stonework that had succumbed to the elements. Fascinated by their mastery and skill, a young lady visiting from Carlisle stopped to watch the stonemasons working. The intricate medieval stonework being repaired was mesmerising, and she stood in awe, fascinated by the talents of the masons. Without warning, a workman approached the woman and stood next to her, also appearing to be mesmerised by the work going on. The woman turned to see a short, scruffy man wearing old-fashioned clothes and a threadbare cloth cap. He smiled and said, "I carved that. Do you like it?" "I like it very much," replied the woman, who quickly realised she was talking to herself. The mysterious man had vanished. Could this be the apparition of a stonemason from the past, checking the work and standards of the current team? The next story was published in a local magazine in 1840. However, the names of those involved were omitted. It seems the names of the witnesses and the ghost have been lost to time. A local man was guiding some visiting friends, a family of 3, around York Minster. He was pointing out some features of the nave to the daughter and noticed her parents had walked further on to look at some ornate tombs and memorials. The girl and the man continued to walk through the nave, admiring the beautiful windows and carvings, when a man in full naval uniform appeared in the distance, heading towards them. Thinking it odd that the officer was wearing such attire when likely to be off duty, the man pointed him out to the girl, who had stopped dead in her tracks. She looked deathly pale and simply stared at the advancing man. The officer approached the girl, his face appearing friendly and warm. He stopped and gently whispered, "There is a future state," quietly in her ear. She stood silently, in shock, with her eyes wide and glazed over. Thinking she was going to faint, the girl managed to make it to a nearby pew. The man sat near her, looking around frantically for the officer who had caused such a frightening reaction. He was gone. Within a few minutes, the girl returned to her usual self, and they continued towards her parents. The girl asked her companion not to mention the encounter with the naval officer to anyone, including her parents. She explained later that the mysterious man in York Minster was in fact her brother, a naval officer on active service at sea many thousands of miles away. When the brother and sister were young, they made a pact that whoever died first would endeavour to appear to the other to confirm if there is an afterlife. The girl was adamant that her brother had perished at sea and had appeared to her to confirm there is a future state, indicating an afterlife. Days later, a message arrived from the Navy, sadly declaring the accidental death of her brother. The date of his death was recorded as the date of their visit to York Minster. One of the best-known ghost stories of York Minster is that of Thomas Gale, who was the Dean of York between 1697 and 1702. Gale was a scholarly man, educated at Westminster School and Trinity College, Cambridge. He became a professor of Greek at Cambridge and a Fellow of the Royal Society. He was well respected and admired for his devotion to his duties at the Minster. He was married to Barbara Pepys, cousin of diarist Samuel Pepys, and had 2 children together, Roger and Samuel Gale. Thomas Gale died on the 7th of April 1702, and on the 15th of April he was buried in a lead coffin inside his beloved York Minster. Mourned by many, rumours quickly spread of his apparition. The Minster continued its regular worship and services. One evening, a Mr. Hawley, a vicar of the Minster, was asked to read the second lesson from the reading desk, which stands in the middle of the choir. As he descended to return to his seat, he stood still and silent, as if he'd turned to stone. He blinked several times and regained his composure. After the service, he declared to other members of staff that he'd been startled to see the apparition of Thomas Gale, sitting in his usual seat, directly in front of him. This, it seems, was the first sighting of Thomas Gale. Samuel Pepys, in the final year of his life, heard the story of the haunting of York Minster and decided to write to Roger Gale, son of the deceased Thomas Gale, to ask his thoughts on the ghost of his father. Roger Gale promptly replied. He described Mr. Hawley as a person never of any credit and a great talker. He goes on to say that before Hawley completed his reading, he had dined that day at the Lord Mayor's table, where there was always wine enough. It seems another member of the church, Dr. Stanforth, had arrived at the service a little late and found his seat occupied by others, so he decided to sit in the Dean's seat. It was Dr. Stanforth that Mr. Hawley had seen. After the service, Mr. Hawley told the story of the ghost of the Dean at a neighbouring coffee house, despite Dr. Stanforth explaining what had happened. Roger Gale explains, "'Twas an easy mistake, the doctor being very much of my father's size and make, not very unlike in the face, being pretty fat, and the stall where he sat dark." Nevertheless, Hawley still continued to tell the story with great enthusiasm in social circles and at society gatherings. York is full of snickleways, narrow streets and alleyways that run between buildings. The word is a portmanteau of snicket, a ginnel, and an alleyway. The Snickleway of Judge's Court is home to one of the most prevalent ghosts in the city of York. His appearance is reported several times each year by visitors, tour guides, and even people working in the nearby hotel. Before he is witnessed, the sound of heavy footsteps and metal lightly striking the paving stones is heard. After several seconds, he appears. A thick-set tall man in a dark coat, standing still, staring menacingly, in the corner of the Snickleway. Who he is or why he appears, nobody knows. In 1960, some properties that border Judge's Court were renovated. Workmen pulled up the floor of one of the kitchens to find a hidden sealed well that had remained forgotten for many years. Deep down in the well, they discovered the skeleton of a man, around 6 foot tall and with a large frame. Whoever he was wore the remnants of dark riding boots, with tinkling metal spurs found nearby. Is this the body of the ghostly apparition who appears at Judge's Court?